Hello, this is the continuation of my read-through of my book, The Baha'i Faith, A Short History. This is the second part of Chapter 11 on Bahai Communities 1922 to the present. Given that this book was first published in 1996, this chapter is obviously out of date, and for a slightly more up-to-date account, you can look at my introduction to the Baha'i Faith from Cambridge. So in this video we'll cover what I'm terming the Baha'i Third World, referring to Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Much of the expansion that has so transformed the Baha'i Faith into a genuinely global religion from its position in the 1950s has been in the Global South, Sub-Saharan Africa, Monsoon Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, and the Pacific Islands. These areas, along with Eastern Asia, which has a rather different Baha'i history, also represent a third world, that's in inverted commas, of Baha'i expansion after the religion's first world of its Islamic heartland and its second of the West. Like the West, there has been a common pattern of development for much of this region, with sustained growth only beginning during the 10-year crusade and the discovery of effective ways of presenting the faith to the rural population. In those areas in which teaching had occurred prior to this, notably South Asia and Latin America, it had tended to be directed towards educated urban social groups using such techniques as public lectures and the distribution of literature. This approach automatically restricted possible contact with the poor and often illiterate rural populations who still constitute the majority of the world's peoples. The widespread growth in the Global South has necessitated the development of new techniques to consolidate the faith and to coordinate the activities of large numbers of new Baha'is. These have included the establishment of Baha'i teaching institutes in remote rural areas, and in Latin America, the development of Baha'i radio stations. More recently, many Baha'i communities have initiated literacy programs as part of an increasing emphasis on socioeconomic development. Although not confined to countries in the Global South, Baha'i development activities are likely to have a more marked impact in such areas, given the relative poverty and lack of resources of many such countries. The situation varies greatly from one country to another, and there has been a general emphasis on developing human capacity, for example through self-help schemes, rather than in the investment of scarce financial resources. Particular emphasis has been directed towards literacy training, education, and the advancement of women, but in several countries Baha'i medical work has also been important, receiving praise from government officials. Also significant has been the emphasis on indigenous culture and the availability of Baha'i development resources to people of all religions and not just Baha'is. Now turning to Asia. Outside the Middle East and Central Asia, here regarded as part of the Islamic heartland of the faith, Asia can be divided into southern, southeastern, and eastern cultural regions, each with its own distinctive Baha'i history. Starting off with South Asia. The first, and also the most important of these, has been South Asia, where Baha'i activity in what was then British India dated from the 1870s. Early Baha'i teaching activity was directed largely towards the educated urban elite and middle classes, and the community remained small, even after the adoption of a more organized approach to teaching. A National Spiritual Assembly was established in 1923, but there was little growth. A series of systematic teaching plans on the American model was embarked upon from 1938 onwards. These led to a marked increase in the number of local assemblies in the newly independent and separate states of India and Pakistan, from 5 in 1939 to a combined total of 28 in 1949, but the total number of Baha'is remained insignificant in relation to the subcontinent's vast population. It was not until 1960-61 that effective contact was first made with the rural population in India. Thereafter, growth was rapid. In 1961, there were still fewer than 1,000 Baha'is in a country with a population of 439 million people. But by 1970, Baha'i numbers had risen to over 300,000, many of the new believers being drawn from scheduled caste and tribal groups in central and northern India. This new approach to teaching was later extended to other parts of India, and there were further increases in numbers, so that the total Baha'i population may now be approaching 2 million. This makes India the largest single Baha'i community in the world, with about 2/5 of the world Baha'i population. The logistical challenge posed by this increase has led to the pioneering development of a third level of Baha'i administration, with elected stated councils taking over much of the work formerly performed by the National Spiritual Assembly. This enormous influx of new Baha'is has radically transformed the religious culture of the Indian community, with a remolding of Muslim cultural elements to more Hinduized forms, even on occasion changing the title Baha'u'llah to Bhagwan Baha. Hindu forms are also evident in the recently completed New Delhi House of Worship, finished in 1986, built in the form of an opening lotus. Growth in the other countries of South Asia has been far more modest. Quite large Baha'i communities have developed in Pakistan and Bangladesh, both predominantly Muslim countries, but many of the Baha'is are drawn from the Hindu minorities. Southeast Asia. The Baha'i faith was first established in Burma, modern Myanmar, in the 1870s. The members of one village later converting en masse. A strong, active community soon developed, forging unique links with the Baha'i World Center by providing the marble sarcophagus that was used to house the Bab's remains. Growth was limited, however, the Baha'is being mostly of Muslim background in a Buddhist majority country. Since Burma's Baha'i linkages were with India until 1959, the community did not form a bridgehead to expansion elsewhere in the region. There were Baha'i visitors to other parts of Southeast Asia as early as the 1880s, but it was not until the late 1940s and early 1950s that there was any permanent settlement of pioneers, mostly from India and Iran, and the beginning of sustained teaching endeavor. A network of groups and assemblies was soon established in much of the region, more rapid growth commencing in several countries from the 1950s onwards. Of early importance here was the mass conversion of several thousand tribal peoples on the Indonesian Mentawai Islands, but along with other international organizations, the Baha'i faith was subsequently banned in 1962, and Baha'i activities in the country ceased. Another area of early rapid growth was South Vietnam, where the number of Baha'is rose to some 40,000 by 1966 and to almost 200,000 by 1975, the year of the communist takeover. In 1976, the Baha'i faith was banned as part of the new government's stringent anti-religious policy. Leading Baha'is were also persecuted. Baha'i activities have recently been allowed to resume, but only in an extremely limited form. It has not yet been possible to attempt to reanimate the former community. The Philippines and Malaysia also experienced sustained growth, the latter concentrated amongst the Indian, Iban, and Chinese peoples, and now have sizable communities. This is a photograph of Sayyid Mustafa Rumi, who had first come to Burma in the 1870s with Jamal Effendi and remained as the key figure in subsequent Baha'i history in Burma up until the time of his death towards the end of World War II, when he was murdered by a nationalist mob. East Asia. The first Baha'is to live in China were Iranian merchants in Shanghai, one as early as the 1860s, but Baha'i activity there only seems to have started in 1914. This was also the year in which two American Baha'is from Hawaii first arrived in Japan. The results of these efforts were extremely meager, and even as late as 1933, Baha'is were living in only 8 localities, 2 with local assemblies, in the whole of East Asia, mostly in Japan. A prolonged period of war and disruption followed. Baha'i activities in Japan resumed in 1945, aided by the settlement of American and Iranian pioneers, but growth was, and remains, extremely modest. Activities in South Korea and Taiwan began in the 1950s, and later in Hong Kong and Macau, all with moderate success. By contrast, the anti-religious policies of the communist governments in the People's Republic of China, North Korea and Mongolia prevented Baha'i expansion in these areas. Following recent political changes, however, a Baha'i community has been established in Mongolia, and there is now a scattering of Baha'is in China. Sub-Saharan Africa. It was not until the 1950s that there was any sustained Baha'i expansion in Sub-Saharan Africa. Baha'i groups had earlier been established in South Africa in about 1912 and Ethiopia in the 1930s, and there were isolated Baha'is in several other countries, but overall there had been little development. This changed rapidly following the start of the 2-year Africa project from 1951 to 53, launched by Sheikh Effendi and coordinated by the British Baha'is. By 1953, pioneers from various countries had opened 14 territories, 17 local spiritual assemblies had been formed, and translations of Baha'i literature had been made into a number of African languages. Progress during the 10-year crusade was even more marked, and by 1963 were probably more than 50,000 Baha'is in the whole continent, and over 1,000 local assemblies had been established. 4 regional assemblies serving enormous areas were formed in 1956 as an overall administrative framework. The pattern of expansion was uneven, with Uganda initially the area of most rapid growth. Accordingly, it was Uganda which Sheikh Effendi designated as the location of both the first African International Conference in 1953 and the construction of the Mother House of Worship for the continent at Kampala, dedicated in 1961. Except for what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, growth was at first largely confined to the British territories, where the prevalence of English and less stringent immigration regulations made pioneer settlement easier. Some of the greatest progress occurred in those areas where indigenous Africans took the lead in expansion activities, however, and in a continent then dominated by European colonialism, the early emergence of African Baha'i leaders was a particularly important development. The areas experiencing the greatest difficulties were those under Portuguese rule, where the Baha'is faced systematic persecution. In what is now Guinea-Bissau, this led to the death of the first African Baha'i martyr in 1966. Since the 1960s, when most African countries became independent, significant progress has continued in many areas, such that there are now probably over 1 million African Baha'is, about 1/5 of the world total. The situation is extremely varied, however, not only in terms of numbers. Nigeria, the Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Zaire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Malawi, Zambia and Zimbabwe, all having significant Baha'i populations, but also in terms of the strength and administrative effectiveness of the individual national Baha'i communities, now nearly all with their national spiritual assemblies. In several countries, there have been Baha'i medical, educational or development projects, which in some cases have attracted favourable attention from governments. But in other countries, political or religious restrictions on Baha'i activity or civil strife, as in Liberia, have impeded growth. The photograph on the left is of Enoch Linga, the eminent Ugandan Baha'i, who was subsequently appointed as one of the Hands of the Cause. And on the right is Eduardo Vieira, a Portuguese Guinean Baha'i who was apparently murdered for his beliefs. So, Latin America. Baha'i activity in Latin America began soon after World War I with the arrival of two American Baha'i women, Martha Root, who made an extensive tour of the region in 1919, and Leonora Holzapper Armstrong, who settled in the Brazilian city of Bahia, Salvador, in 1921. There was no sustained support from the North American Baha'i community until the 1930s, however, and Baha'i expansion only really began with the first 7-year plan, that's from 1937 to 44. Under Shoghi Effendi's direction, pioneers settled in all the independent republics. Teaching commenced, and by 1943, a total of 19 local assemblies had been established. In 1945, the first Latin American Baha'i Congress was held in Panama, and in 1947, administrative direction was passed from the North American to the Latin American Baha'is, with the formation of two regional teaching committees, one for South America and one for Central America and the Antilles. The committees were replaced by two elected assemblies in 1951, and in 1961, 21 independent national assemblies came into existence. Although the new Baha'i groups were often extremely active, with programs of public meetings, translation and publication, radio broadcasts, children's classes and the like, growth was limited. Activities were generally North American in style and largely directed towards the urban educated minority. This situation started to change dramatically when contact began to be made with the generally poor, rural, and often illiterate native Amerindian population. This involved bridging a marked cultural divide. The first breakthrough occurred in Bolivia in 1956, where the community rapidly grew to some 8,000 Baha'is, with 98 local spiritual assemblies by 1963. Similar breakthroughs occurred in Panama around about 1961, where Baha'is from the small Amerindian minority soon came to form a large proportion of the Baha'i community there, and eventually in most other countries with Amerindian minorities. In Brazil, with its greater ethnic diversity, mass teaching from the 1970s onwards led to a comparable expansion, so that along with Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia and Venezuela, it now has one of the largest Latin American Baha'i communities. All told, there are now probably 750,000 Baha'is in the region, some 16% of the world's total. The region's first house of worship was opened in Panama in 1972. Also of note has been the pioneering role of Latin America in developing Baha'i radio stations since 1973, used as a means of informing scattered rural populations about the Baha'i teachings, as well as promoting indigenous culture. Amerindian Baha'i cultural troupes have also performed widely outside Latin America. The situation in the Caribbean has been somewhat different. Most of the islands are small, and until recently remained under colonial control. Baha'i expansion was at first extremely limited, and it was not until the 1960s that sustained activity began in many countries, with independent national spiritual assemblies being established mostly in the 1970s and 1980s. The total number of Baha'is still remains small, but given the often tiny size of the host populations, they represent a significant minority in several countries. The exception to the general pattern has been Cuba, where government restrictions have impeded growth. Except for the Anglo-Pacific, that is Australia, New Zealand and Hawaii, there was effectively no Baha'i activity here until the 10-year crusade, when pioneers settled in many of the island groups. A regional assembly was established in 1959. Growth was at first generally slow, and there was bitter opposition to Baha'i activities by some of the Christian churches on several islands, leading in some instances to actual persecution. Many communities then experienced rapid expansion, so that now a number of countries have Baha'i minorities of over 5 and even 10% of the total population, although constituting only a small minority of the world's Baha'i population, less than 2%, excluding Australia and New Zealand. The Pacific represents one of the most important areas of Baha'i expansion. It is also of note that the only head of state in the world who is a Baha'i is Malietoa Tanumafili II of Western Samoa. Samoa is also the site of the first Baha'i house of worship in the region outside Australia, opened in 1984. Many thanks to my patrons, Ian Palin and Tricia Williams, and to all of you who've been listening. You're welcome to support my channel, like the videos if you want, subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and if you'd like to support the channel's growth on Patreon or PayPal, you're very welcome, links below. Again, thank you for listening and have a good day.